नाजरीन, हमने लाइब्रेरी से कुछ इंटरव्यूज़, टेलीविज़न इंटरव्यूज़ रिट्रीव किए हैं। उनमें सबसे अहम मरहूम आगा शाहिद अली का एक तवील टेलीविज़न इंटरव्यू है, विच इज़ द ओनली इंटरव्यू अवेलेबल इन कश्मीर। इस तवील इंटरव्यू को हम आपके सामने पेश करेंगे इस टाइटल के तहत, दौड़ पीछे की तरफ ए गर्दिशे अयाम तू, या हम इसका ये भी टाइटल रख सकते हैं, पीप इनटू द पास्ट, क्योंकि ये वो ख़जाना है या ये वो ट्रेजर है जो अब बिल्कुल नायाब है। आगा शाहिद अली न सिर्फ ग्लोबली नोन पोइट थे, लेकिन कश्मीर में उनकी बहुत ही सराहना की गई जब उन्होंने एक सिलेक्टेड पोएम्स की एक कलेक्शन निकाली, अ कंट्री विदाउट अ पोस्ट ऑफिस। आगा शाहिद अली ने दौराने इंटरव्यू कुछ अपने बारे में बात की, अपने बचपन के बारे में बात की। उन्होंने हमको टेलीविज़न इंटरव्यू के दौरान ये कहा कि हाउ ही वाज फैसिनेटेड बाय द कलर्स एंड हाउ ही वाज ड्यूरिंग हिज चाइल्डहुड वेरी enthusiastic to know about Hinduism, about Christianity, because there were diverse influences over him as a child. और poems के बारे में उनका ये कहना था कि right from the childhood he started on his typewriter writing the poems. उनके करीबी दोस्त इरफान हसन का कहना है कि उन्होंने ये देखा है कि at the age of 8 he wrote his first poem. मरहूम आगा शाहिद अली ने कश्मीर के बारे में बहुत सी पोइट्री लिखी है, नॉट ओनली द कंट्री विदाउट अ पोस्ट ऑफिस बट ऑल्सो हाफ इंच हिमालयाज़, जिसमें मशहूर उनकी पोइम है कश्मीर इन माई मेल बॉक्स। तो ये जो उनका ये तवील टेलीविज़न इंटरव्यू है, इसको हम 4 हिस्सों में बांटेंगे। आज आप उसका पहला किस्त देखेंगे और हमें उम्मीद है कि आप बहुत पसंद करेंगे कि ऐसी शोहरे आफाक पर्सनालिटी हमारे कश्मीर से निकली है और ग्लोबली पोइटिक हॉराइजन पर छाई है।
Of your childhood and some of the memories of your childhood which you still remember and are engrossed with.
Okay. You know, I don't know whether I can talk about my memories very precisely, because my memories these days are very much engaged with my mother, who, as you know, died 3 months ago roughly. So all my memories are in one way or the other connected with her right now. So I can't talk about all my childhood memories, but I can talk about various ones connected with her and growing up in this house. So if you'd ask me very specific about a specific memory, I'd be a little better.
How did you spend your from your childhood up to your adolescence? Some interesting incidents.
Well, I'll tell you one thing I did. My parents have been very liberal in their understanding of a child's needs. So they never imposed their way of looking at the world on me or on any one of us. They made us study, but they didn't force us to study. They said they did not create an atmosphere in which you feel that you have to be one thing or the other. So when I was a child, I wanted to learn, for example, sitar. So I learned the sitar, you see, and I wanted to learn dancing, Indian classical dancing. So I learned that for a short while, not too long, maybe a month. But I played the sitar for a few years. I remember getting a first prize in a sitar competition. I wanted to paint. I painted a lot. I wanted to write. I started writing. So obviously I was inclined towards the arts, the creative arts and also the humanities. I was not inclined temperamentally towards the sciences, though, because everyone used to say मैं engineer बनूंगा, मैं doctor बनूंगा, तो मैं भी कहता था I'll be an engineer. But obviously I was not going to be an engineer. I would have, if I'd been an engineer, all the bridges in Kashmir would be falling down, the buildings too. So I remember, then I went to the convent school I went to Bisco, I went to Burnhall, I went to all three of those schools. So there was a Christian influence. My mother came from a family whose ancestor is the saint who founded Radoli Sharif near Lucknow. He's her direct ancestor. Her fathers, who came from Iran he was one of the Sufi saints, and his tomb is in Radoli. So we had a very strong, let's say, poetry and music were very vivid presences in our home. And I must say, and I will be boasting now, that of all my relatives and most other Kashmiri homes I saw, in our home there was a genuine intellectual culture. That is, there was a constant engagement with ideas, with books, with politics in the realm of ideas. I'm not talking about a narrow politics, about what was happening in the world, poetry, and so on. It was constantly there. And the friends we had, the people who came here, through them, with them, because of them, or because of us, they also were able to imbibe this intellectual climate. So there was a spirit of great tolerance in our home and of compassion. I think I learned a lot of humanity from my parents, concern for other people, and a very great distaste for corruption and exploitation. This is self-congratulation on my part. I am praising myself and my family in this case. So I was given a chance to express myself. I wanted to write poetry. I wrote some poems. My mother said, "Oh, I really like these." My father did not say they were good, but he brought me a beautiful leather-bound notebook and said, "Write your poems in it." He didn't say these are good poems. He didn't say they are bad poems. He said, "Write." So there was constant encouragement. And afterwards, when I had filled up that book a few years later and I had become 17, my father gave me another beautiful leather-bound notebook, and he wrote on it, "Another notebook for the same game. Spontaneous self-expression must now grow into studied attempts at conciseness and discipline," which I think is brilliant advice for someone who wants to write, and not write just to express himself, but is eager to become a poet, to be a poet. That is, wants to be an artist, not just a poet who has a poetic manner or a poetic disposition, but someone who actually wants to then grow to be a poet, a recognizable artist who's interested in art. So I started writing. That's the first time I understood this business of discipline in art, just because my father used the word discipline. Otherwise I used to write 20 poems a day, 30 poems a day. They're all nonsense, obviously. I could sit and just go on writing. Then I remember sending, by the time I was 18 or 19, I used to send poems out regularly to magazines in India and abroad, in Canada and the United States and England. And all these poems, and Australia, I was eager to find out which were the top literary journals of the world. I kept submitting poems, and they all were rejected. And I got poems rejected from Quest. There was a magazine in India called Quest, which has a descendant called New Quest. And Quest was a very fine magazine. New Quest is really not that well done. Their standards have fallen quite miserably. But when it was Quest, under an editor called Saeed Ayub, I think was his name, it was really a well done journal. It had the feel of standard, that there was some of standards, of international standards. So I used to send them poems. They all got rejected. I would send for a whole year, and then I got a letter from him saying, a note on the rejection slip. He said, "Please don't send us any more poems. They are far below our standard." This is what he wrote. And I think I was defiant. I didn't take it, I was not crushed by this rejection, but I was open enough and confident enough to realize there must be something here. Somebody's using a word like standard. They are far below our standards. What are these standards? And so I started reading more carefully, and I started reading contemporary and, well, let's say 20th century poetry in English. And I discovered that there are standards in art. and that was a very good, I would say, panacea for me. This rejection slip, and 2 years later I sent him a poem. He took it. You see, because I started working hard on the craft, and not just on self-expression. Yes. I remember. I have to tell you one thing. Okay, sorry. Can I?
Yeah.
I remember once going to a fancy dress party, dressed as Krishna. And people said, "Oh, why are you dressed as Krishna?" I said, "It's a fancy dress party. I wanted to dress as Krishna." You see, for me as a child, I loved color. And as you know, Islam doesn't provide you with too much color. It's much later I grew to appreciate the simplicity of Islamic architecture and the grace of its calligraphy. But religion has been an inspiring factor for writers and poets and artists throughout the centuries. But because images were banned in Islam, you find that some of the great work has been done in architecture and in calligraphy. That's where some of the most amazing calligraphy is. For example, this thing is an original of a famous Egyptian calligrapher. And I just love to look at it. It's so beautiful, its shape, its form, and so on. But as a child of 10 and 11 and 12, I did not find Islam exciting because there was no color, no image. And so I used to like Christianity because I was in the convent school, and I used to go into the chapel to impress the nuns. You know, at that age you want to impress the nuns and you cross yourself and dip your hand in holy water. I liked the ritual of it. And I liked Hinduism a lot because there was dance and singing, and you see there was all this constant ritual with flowers and gods and and so on and so forth. So I was very, very attracted to these things as a child. But now I realized that it was my temperament which wanted color and wanted ritual and color.
Mr. Shahid, was there any kind of an inclination towards a romance or some kind of romantic inclination within yourself that finally threw you into the lap of poetry, or was it a natural instinct within yourself?
When you say romantic is a term that can mean almost anything. The whole term. Now, what do you mean by romantic? Then I'll know.
I mean, was there any obsession in your soul or in yourself which finally?
You mean obsession with someone or with
some object, with someone or something like that? Was there any obsession?
I think everything was an obsession. I think language was an obsession. As a poet, I think it has to be language. And then if you're going through some other kind of obsession, then you find the language that will approximate that obsession. I would say I have, this is a phrase, I think they say this about Keats, I have always had a very sensuous apprehension of things. By sensuous, I mean of the senses. There's a difference between sensuous and sensual. Sensual always has a sexual implication. Sensuous, that means a sensual experience is a sensuous experience, but a sensuous experience is not necessarily a sexual experience. So by senses I mean smell, taste, seeing, touching, all of these. And I'm by no means ruling out the sensual, but I'm just saying that I always felt things they are tactile elements very strongly. So I think the sensuous element exists, has been a very strong part of my parents, because they really responded to poetry and music. I think that one of the reasons my parents have had, I would say, a closer marriage than many marriages I've seen is there has been a lot of companionship there. And there has been a joint appreciation of things like poetry and music. So yes, I remember certain smells as a child. Those were obsessions. I remember the smells of certain foods, Mughlai food, Kashmiri food, Hyderabadi food. I love the smell of Nasasai in the spring in Kashmir. I mean, I used to always look eagerly forward to it. Certain sunny days, certain rainy days. And I don't know whether that makes me particularly different. I would say most people have some sort of sensuous response to the world. It's just that many of them don't quite articulate it.